"You are going to take this, Elara, all of it." The words hung heavy in the candlelit master bedroom, thick with tension and the scent of expensive tobacco. Elara Vance, a woman standing a striking 6'3", felt her blood run cold. She backed herself against the mahogany wardrobe, her chest heaving, staring wide-eyed at her new husband, Silas Thorne, a man who barely reached her shoulder. He was unlatching a heavy velvet-lined box on their wedding bed, his rough, calloused hands shaking with an intensity she couldn't place. Was it anger? Was it hunger? "It is the biggest one in the entire territory," Silas murmured, a strange, desperate smile cracking his weathered face as he looked up at her towering frame. "And tonight, whether you are ready or not, it belongs to you." Elara's breath hitched. She had come to Wyoming to escape a life of ridicule, thinking she had found a simple rancher. Instead, she had married a man with a secret. What was the wealthy cattle baron forcing upon his giant mail-order bride? Why was he trembling? And why did Elara get the sinking feeling that her massive height, the very thing she had been shamed for her entire life, was the only reason she was trapped in this room right now? Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into Journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you. So drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. But to understand why Elara was trembling in that candlelit bedroom, frozen in fear before a man half her size, we have to go back. We have to rewind the clock exactly 12 hours to the moment the steam train screeched to a halt in the dusty, bustling town of Iron Creek, Wyoming. The station platform was a chaotic sea of Stetson hats, bustle skirts, and shouting merchants haggling over supplies. But the moment Elara Vance stepped off that train, the noise seemed to die out. It didn't taper off naturally. It was sucked out of the air, replaced by a heavy, awkward silence. Heads turned, whispers hissed behind gloved hands. Elara was used to the stairs. In fact, she had lived her entire life under the weight of them. At 6'3", she didn't just step off a train. She descended like a monument. She had to duck her head significantly just to clear the carriage door, a movement that had become second nature to her since she was 14 years old. Back in Chicago, she had sprouted past every boy in her schoolyard, growing like a wild oak in a garden of primroses. Her late father, a pragmatic bricklayer, used to say Elara was built for survival, not for sitting in parlors sipping tea. But when he passed, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debt and a cruel aunt who resented feeding, a girl the size of a draft horse, Elara's survival instinct was the only thing she had left. She had spent the last 3 years hunched over scrubbing floors in a boarding house, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. But you can't hide a giant. When her aunt finally threw her out, claiming she took up too much room and ate too much food, Elara did the only thing a desperate woman with no prospects could do. She answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. A rancher in Wyoming named Silas Thorne had written to her. His letters were kind, if brief. He spoke of the open plains, the hard work of the frontier, and his need for a woman of strong character. He never asked for a photograph. He never asked about her height. And Elara, terrified of rejection, never told him. Now, standing on the wooden planks of the Iron Creek station, gripping the handle of her battered, rope-tied trunk, Elara felt the familiar cold dread settle in her stomach. She scanned the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was looking for a rugged, imposing cattleman, someone big enough to match the vastness of this territory. "Miss Vance?" The voice came from somewhere near her elbow. Elara looked down. Then she looked down further. Standing there, clutching a dusty felt hat with white-knuckled tension, was a man who might have been 5'5" on his tiptoes. He had a face weathered by the harsh Wyoming wind, etched with lines around kind, dark eyes that were currently squinting up at her against the midday sun. This was Silas Thorne. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She saw the realization hit him in real time. She watched his eyes travel up and up and up, taking in the sheer, undeniable mass of her. She braced herself for the flinch. She waited for the look of disgust she knew so well, the moment he would stumble backward, stammer an apology, and tell her there had been a terrible mistake. She prepared herself to be abandoned on this platform, 1,000 miles from home with $2 in her pocket. But Silas didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. Instead, a slow, warm smile spread across his face, softening the rugged angles of his jaw. It wasn't a mocking smile. It was the look of a man who had just found a gold nugget in a muddy stream. "Elara," he said, his voice deep and steady, grounding her instantly. You are even more magnificent than I imagined." Elara blinked, the air catching in her throat. Magnificent? People called her useful, sturdy, or mostly, that big girl. No one had ever called her magnificent. She waited for the punchline, the cruel laughter of the townspeople. But Silas just stepped forward, ignoring the gawking crowd, and reached up to gently take her hand. "Welcome home," he whispered. Before she could process the shock of his kindness, Silas was hefting her heavy trunk. He struggled for a moment, his smaller frame straining, but he refused her help, determined to be the gentleman. He led her not to a buckboard wagon or a mule, but to a polished, high-wheeled carriage that looked wildly out of place in this rough frontier town. The ride to his property was the second warning that nothing was as it seemed. Elara had expected a homestead, a sod house, maybe a small cabin with a few acres of scrubland. That was what mail-order brides got. But as they rolled out of town, the landscape opened up into an endless sea of green pastures. They passed herd after herd of cattle, hundreds of them, all branded with a stylized T. They passed cowboys riding the fence lines who stopped, tipped their hats, and called out, "Afternoon, boss," to Silas with distinct respect. "Silas?" Elara asked, her voice trembling slightly as she gripped the leather seat. "All these cows, do you work for the owner?" Silas looked at her, his eyes twinkling with a secret. "In a manner of speaking, I suppose. I work for the land." But when they crested the final ridge, the truth became undeniable. Nestled in the valley wasn't a shack. It was a sprawling two-story ranch house painted white, with a wraparound porch, stained glass windows catching the dying sunlight, and barns that were larger than the boarding house she had grown up in. It was a kingdom. "This is yours?" she gasped, her voice sounding small for the first time in her life. "Ours," Silas corrected softly, a fierce possessiveness entering his tone. "As of today, it is ours." A chill that had nothing to do with the wind ran down Elara's spine. Silas Thorne wasn't just a cowboy, he was a tycoon. He was rich, powerful, and established. And men like him, kings of the frontier, did not marry penniless, giant women from Chicago unless they had a very specific dark reason for doing so. She looked at his hands on the reins, calloused, yes, but gripping with a determination that suddenly looked less like nervousness and more like desperation. Why did he bring her here? What did he really want from her? As the carriage rolled toward the mansion, Elara realized with a sinking heart that the hardest part of her journey wasn't the train ride. It was surviving whatever awaited her inside those doors. The wedding happened so fast that Elara barely had time to wipe the dust of the road from her face. 1 minute she was standing in the cavernous, high-ceilinged parlor of the Thorne ranch house, terrified to touch the velvet drapes for fear of soiling them, and the next she was standing before a hurried preacher. The ceremony was a blur of mumbled vows and flickering candlelight. Elara felt like a giant intruder in a dollhouse. When Silas reached out to take her hand for the ring exchange, his fingers barely wrapped halfway around her broad palm. He had to stretch his arm up just to hold on to her, a visual mismatch that made the two ranch hands acting as witnesses shift uncomfortably in their boots. But there was someone else watching too, a woman named Lydia Sterling. Lydia was everything Elara was not, petite, delicate, and wrapped in emerald silk that likely cost more than Elara had earned in her entire life. She had porcelain skin and golden curls arranged in a complicated style that defied the Wyoming wind. Throughout the ceremony, Lydia watched with eyes like a hawk circling a field mouse. And the moment the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Lydia's polite smile sharpened into something dangerous. As the preacher packed his Bible, Lydia glided over to Silas. She didn't even look at Elara at first. She placed a small gloved hand on Silas's arm, a touch that was far too familiar. "I will pray for you, Silas," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Taking in a woman of Such substantial proportions. Well, charity is a true Christian virtue, isn't it? The words hit Elara like a physical blow to the stomach. Charity. Of course. That was the only explanation that made sense to a world that worshipped small, fragile women. Silas Thorne, the wealthy widower, had pitied the giant spinster from Chicago. He had married her out of some twisted sense of duty, probably planning to put her to work in the fields with the oxen where someone of her size belonged. Elara wanted to sink through the polished floorboards. She waited for Silas to agree, to share a knowing look with this beautiful petite woman. But Silas stiffened. He gently but firmly removed Lydia's hand from his arm. "It isn't charity, Lydia," he said, his voice cold steel, "and you will show my wife the proper respect, or you will not be welcome on this land." Lydia's eyes widened in shock, and she swept out of the house in a huff of silk and indignation. But damage was done. The seed of doubt had been watered in Elara's heart. If Elara expected Silas to distance himself after that awkward display, she was wrong. He took her hand again, his grip surprisingly strong, and led her on a tour of the house. It was a palace on the prairie. Every room was grander than the last, filled with furniture ordered from catalogs in the East, cast-iron stoves that gleamed with new polish, and rugs that felt like clouds under her worn boots. But the tour stopped abruptly on the second floor. They were standing outside a closed oak door at the end of the hallway. Silas's hand hovered over the knob, and his entire demeanor changed. The confident cattle baron vanished, replaced by a man haunted by ghosts. "This was going to be the nursery," he whispered, the silence of the hallway swallowing his voice. Elara watched his profile, the way pain etched deep lines around his mouth. "My first wife, Alice. She died 3 years ago," Silas confessed, staring at the wood grain. "Her and the baby. Childbirth took them both in the same night." Elara's heart broke for him. She understood loss. She had lost her parents, her home, her dignity. They were two broken people standing in a hallway of expensive things. "I am so sorry, Silas," she said softly. He looked up at her then, and for a second, Elara saw a flash of that same intense look he had given her at the train station, a mix of sorrow and strange, fierce hope. "Don't be sorry," he rasped. "You are here now. That is what matters." He guided her to the master bedroom last. It was a massive room with windows overlooking the sprawling ranch, dominated by a 4-poster bed so large it looked like a ship at sea. "I will give you time to freshen up," Silas said, stepping back toward door, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. I will be downstairs. Take all the time you need." Then he was gone. Elara was alone. The silence of the room was deafening. She stood in front of a tall mirror, looking at her reflection. She was still wearing the plain gray dress she had traveled in, the fabric strained across her broad shoulders. She looked like a mountain in a room designed for flowers. Panic began to rise in her throat like bile. She knew what came next. She had heard the whispers of the girls at the boarding house about wedding nights. They spoke of it with giggles and feigned horror, but for Elara, the fear was different. How could a man as small as Silas manage a woman like her? Would he be disgusted when he saw the sheer expanse of her skin? Would he realize, in the intimacy of this room, that he had made a terrible mistake? Would he try to touch her and find her repugnant? Or worse, would he hurt himself trying to prove he was the man of the house? Her large hands shook so badly she couldn't undo buttons of her dress. She fumbled with the fabric, tears stinging her eyes. She felt trapped, a giant beast caught in a trap of silk and expectations. She was terrified not just of the act, but of the inevitable rejection. She was sure that once the candle was out, Silas would see her for what everyone else saw, a freak. The sun began to set, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the bedspread. Elara stood frozen near the wardrobe, her heart thudding so hard she thought it might crack a rib. Then there was a knock. It was soft, polite, almost hesitant. "Elara," Silas's voice came through the wood. "May I come in?" She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. But she forced out a strangled yes. The door creaked open. Silas stepped inside. He had removed his jacket and his boots, standing in his stocking feet, which made him look even smaller against the grandeur of the room. But it wasn't his height that caught Elara's attention. It was what he was carrying. In his hands, which were trembling visibly, he held an old polished wooden box. He walked to the bed and set the box down on the quilt with reverence, as if it contained a bomb or a holy relic. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made Elara want to run. It wasn't lust. It was an intense, terrifying vulnerability. "I need to show you something," Silas said, his voice shaking. Before anything else happens between us tonight, I need you to understand." Elara pressed her back against the wardrobe. She had seen this before with men who liked to exert control. They wanted submission. They wanted to prove that even a giant could be made small. "Understand what?" she whispered, bracing herself. Silas unlatched the box. The click echoed in the silent room. He lifted the lid, and Elara gasped. Inside wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a whip. It was a ring, a massive emerald ring, the stone the size of a pigeon's egg, glowing green in the lamplight. Beside it lay a stack of folded legal papers. Silas picked up the ring. His hand shook so hard the emerald caught the light in frantic flashes. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice cracking. "Then my mother's. Then Alice's." Elara took a step back. "No," she breathed. "Elara, please." "No!" The word ripped out of her. "You want me to be her? Is that it?" Tears hot with shame spilled down her cheeks. "You want me to wear a dead woman's jewelry? You want me to shrink myself down and pretend to be delicate and petite like Alice? I can't do it, Silas." She was shouting now, the fear taking over. "I am not small. I am not refined. I am just a big, clumsy weed from Chicago. I can't fit into your dead wife's life." Silas froze. The ring hung in the air between them. The tension in the room snapped tight as a bowstring. Elara waited for him to yell to tell her to get out. Instead, Silas's face darkened, not with anger at her, but with a fierce, sudden intensity. "Stop," he commanded, his voice surprisingly booming for a man of his stature. "You think I want you to be small?" He took a step toward her, forcing her to look down at him. "You think I brought you 1,000 miles to Wyoming to make you disappear?" "Elara, listen to me." Silas's voice cracked, raw and desperate, echoing off the high ceilings. He moved closer, craning his neck to look her in the eye. His face flushed not with anger, but with a fierce, pleading intensity. "I chose you because you are not small, because in every letter you sent, even though I know you didn't hold the pen yourself, I could feel your fight." Elara's breath hitched in her throat. He knew. He knew she hadn't written those letters herself, knew she was barely literate, and yet he was standing there, looking at her like she was the only water in a desert. "I could feel your courage," Silas continued, tears now shining in his own dark eyes. "Your refusal to apologize for taking up space in a world that wanted to shrink you. I prayed, God, Elara, I prayed every night that you were as strong in the flesh as you were on paper." He reached out and grabbed her hands. His fingers disappeared inside her massive palms, but he held on tight, anchoring himself to her. "But Lydia said," Elara started, her voice trembling. Silas let out a bitter, sharp laugh. "Lydia Sterling is angry because I wouldn't marry her sister. She hates you because 3 years ago, I told her family I would never marry a delicate woman again. I told them I would never watch another wife die because she wasn't built to survive this life." The room seemed to spin. Elara blinked, the pieces of the puzzle floating around her but not quite fitting. What are you saying?" Silas squeezed her hands, his expression crumbling into a look of pure devastation. "I am saying that Alice was 5 feet tall. She weighed 90 pounds soaking wet. She was beautiful, dainty, everything a rich man's wife is supposed to be." He swallowed hard, the memory clearly choking him. "Everyone said we were the perfect couple. She made me look tall. She made me look strong." He took a shaky breath. "But the frontier doesn't care about pretty. The winter that year was brutal. When she went into labor, it was too early. She was too small, Elara. Her body, it couldn't handle it." Elara went still, horror washing over her. "I watched her bleed to death in this very bed," Silas whispered, the confession tearing out of him. "I watched our son die in her arms because she was too fragile to bring him into this world, And when I buried them, I swore an oath. I swore I would never, ever put a woman through that again if she couldn't survive it. He released her hands and snatched the ring up from the quilt. He held it up to the lamplight, the emerald blazing like a green fire. You think this is a dainty trinket? Silas shook his head fervently. This stone is the heaviest in the territory. It belonged to my grandmother, Esther. She was 6 feet tall and could outride and outshoot any man in 3 counties. After her, it went to my mother, Catherine. She was 5'11", broad-shouldered and tough as leather. She ran this ranch alone for 20 years after my father passed. She broke horses, she delivered calves in blizzards, and she once fought off a grizzly bear with nothing but a garden shovel. Silas's hands were shaking again, but this time Elara realized it wasn't fear, it was reverence. These women survived, Elara. They were titans. And when I put this ring on Alice, it looked wrong. It was too heavy for her hand. It slid off her finger. He looked up at Elara, his eyes burning. When I saw you on that platform today, when I saw you towering over the crowd, stepping off that train like a queen, I didn't see a freak. I saw them. I saw a woman built for surviving, not for breaking. Elara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her entire life, her size had been a curse. It was the reason she was poor, the reason she was mocked, the reason she was alone. And now, this man was telling her it was the only reason he wanted her. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas set the ring down gently. Then he picked up the folded papers. His demeanor shifted from grief to determination. Then let me make it crystal clear. He thrust the papers toward her. This is the deed to the ranch. But look closer at the names. Elara took the heavy parchment. Her reading was poor, but she knew her own name. And there it was, written in elegant, looping script next to his, Elara Vance Thorne. I had my lawyer draw this up the morning after I got your first letter, Silas said firmly. As of this moment, you are not just my wife. You are the legal owner of half of this ranch. Half the land, half the herd, half the money in the bank. It is all yours. Elara stared at the document, her hands trembling so violently the paper rattled. You are giving me half of everything? She choked out. But Silas, you barely know me. I am nobody. I am a desperate maid from Chicago who answered an ad because she had nowhere else to go. I can't play the piano. I don't know which fork to use at dinner. I am not a lady. I don't need a lady, Silas shouted, the passion in his voice making her jump. I need a partner. I need someone who can stand beside me, not cower behind me. I need a woman strong enough to birth healthy children without dying in the process. I need someone who can run this empire when I am gone. Someone who can stare down a Wyoming winter and not blink. He stepped closer, invading her space, but this time Elara didn't back away. She couldn't. I am not asking you to be perfect, Elara, he said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. I am asking you to be strong, and I know you are. I saw it in the way you held your head up at the station. I saw it in the way you walked through that town. He pointed a shaking finger at the papers in her hand. Wait, Elara breathed, her mind reeling as the reality of his words crashed into her. You are putting that inside me? This trust? This power? I am giving you everything I have, Silas vowed, looking up at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart wide open. Because you are the only one big enough to carry it. Because you are the only one big enough to carry it. As those words hung in the warm air of the bedroom, Elara's legs simply stopped working. The exhaustion of the journey, the terror of the wedding, and the overwhelming shock of this revelation crashed into her all at once. Her knees gave out, and she sank onto the thick Persian rug, the silk of her dress pooling around her like a silver ocean. For the first time in her adult life, she was eye level with a man. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't loom over her. He immediately dropped to his knees, disregarding his expensive trousers, shuffling forward until he was right in front of her. He was still clutching that ring and those deed papers as if they were holy scriptures. I can't be her, Elara sobbed, her face burying into her hands. The dam had broken, and 28 years of shame were pouring out. I can't be Alice. I can't be your mother. I am just Elara. I am too big, and I am too loud. and I am too much for everyone who has ever known me." Silas reached out and cupped her tear-streaked face in his rough, calloused hands. His thumbs brushed away the salt of her tears. "You are not too much," he whispered fiercely, his forehead pressing against hers. "You are exactly enough, and I don't want you to be anyone but yourself." They knelt there together, the small cattle baron and his giant bride, huddled on the floor of a mansion that felt too big for both of them. And then Elara felt Silas tremble. A choked sound escaped his throat, and she realized he was crying too. "I am so tired of being alone, Elara," he admitted, his voice barely a breath against her skin. "I am so tired of being afraid that everything I love will break in my hands. But when I saw you on that platform, when I saw you taking up space and refusing to apologize for it, I felt hope for the first time in 3 years." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his gaze intense and burning. "Please, Elara, please let me put this inside you. Not just the ring, but this truth, this partnership, this future we could build. Let me give you half of everything I have and prove to you that you are worth it all." Something inside Elara shattered. Not her heart, but the cage she had built around it. She didn't think, she didn't plan. She just reached out with her massive hands, framed Silas's weathered face, and kissed him. She kissed him with every ounce of loneliness, hope, and desperate gratitude she had carried since she was a girl, and Silas kissed her back like a drowning man finding air. When they finally broke apart, breathless and flushed, Silas's hat lay forgotten on the floor, and Elara's hair was tumbling loose from its pins. Silas let out a shaky, wet laugh, his eyes shining. "So," he said, clearing his throat and holding up the emerald again, "about this ring. It is a bit unconventional, but I had it sized specifically for you." Elara wiped her eyes, staring at the green stone. "How?" she sniffled. "How did you know my size? You never asked." Silas grinned, looking suddenly boyish. "I wrote to your boarding house owner back in Chicago, Mrs. Patterson. I asked her for all your measurements weeks ago. I wanted everything to be ready when you arrived." He took her left hand, her large, strong hand that she had hidden in pockets her whole life, and slid the ring onto her finger. It didn't get stuck at the knuckle. It didn't pinch. It slid home perfectly, resting there as if it had been waiting for her since the earth cooled. The emerald blazed in the lamplight, heavy and solid. It was bigger than anything she had ever touched, let alone worn. "This really is the biggest I will ever see, isn't it?" she whispered, looking from the ring to the deed, and finally to the man who had given her both without asking for a thing in return. Silas's smile softened into something incredibly tender. "Darling," he said, "we're just getting started." He helped her stand, his grip steadying her. As she rose, Elara winced slightly, reaching back to tug at her dress. She was still trapped in the borrowed wedding gown, the silk tight and restrictive. Jesse noticed, she realized. He saw her discomfort immediately. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her back. Elara nodded, turning around. She felt his fingers, warm and patient, working the tiny buttons she hadn't been able to reach. As the fabric loosened, allowing her to take her first deep breath in hours, a new wave of insecurity hit her. "I'm not educated, Silas," she confessed to the wall, her voice trembling again. "I can barely write my own name. The railroad clerk, he helped me with those letters. He made me sound smarter than I am." Silas's fingers paused on the last button. "Elara, look at me." She turned, clutching the bodice of the dress to her chest. Silas looked almost angry again, his jaw set. "Intelligence isn't just about reading books in a library," he stated firmly. "You survived losing your father. You survived being abandoned by your family. You worked yourself to the bone in a city that didn't want you, and you had the courage to travel across a continent to marry a stranger." He stepped closer, resting his hands on her bare shoulders. "That takes intelligence, Elara. That takes strategy. That is a strength most educated men in this territory don't have." He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "If you want to learn to read better, I will teach you. We have long winters here and nothing but time. I have a whole library downstairs. But don't you dare think you are not smart enough for me. Choosing you, that was the smartest decision I ever made." Elara let the dress fall to the floor. She stood there in her plain cotton undergarments, towering over her husband, stripped of all her defenses. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to shrink. She didn't feel like a monster. Silas looked at her not with lust, but with awe, like she was a rare Wyoming sunset he couldn't quite believe he was witnessing. "You are so beautiful," he whispered. "Do you have any idea how beautiful you are?" Elara shook her head. She had no words left. Silas didn't push her. He simply turned and pulled back the heavy quilt on the massive bed. He took her hand and led her toward it, but there was no rush, no demand. They didn't consummate the marriage that night. There was too much emotion, too much exhaustion, and too much gratitude filling the room. Instead, Silas blew out the lamp and climbed in beside her. He wrapped himself around her as much as he could, the small cowboy holding onto his giant bride as if she were the anchor keeping him on earth. In the darkness, he told her stories. He whispered about the ranch, about the cattle drives in the spring, and the foals that would be born in the next month. "You will help name them," he murmured against her shoulder as her eyes grew heavy. "You will help with everything. This is your ranch now too, Elara. Your home, your future." Elara fell asleep wearing an emerald ring worth a fortune, wrapped in the arms of a man who had chosen her strength over another woman's delicacy. And as the Wyoming wind howled outside, for the first time since her father died, she felt safe. 6 months later, the snow had melted off the Wyoming peaks, replaced by the vibrant green of early summer. Elara Thorne stood in the center of the bustling ranch yard, 7 months pregnant, with a belly so large she hadn't seen her own boots in weeks. But she wasn't hiding indoors. She was standing tall, pointing a gloved hand toward the corrals with a voice that carried clear across the valley floor. "No, not that pen, Roberts," she shouted, her tone firm but kind. "The heifers need more grazing space. Move them to the east pasture where the clover is coming in thick. And watch that roan mare. She is favoring her left leg today." The ranch hands jumped to obey without a second's hesitation. They had learned quickly that new Mrs. Thorne might be soft-spoken with her husband, but she ran the ranch operations like a general commanding a loyal army. There was no mockery in their eyes now, only respect. They had seen her pull a calf out of a mudslide with her bare hands, and they had eaten the bread she baked at dawn. To them, she wasn't a giant. She was the matriarch this land had been waiting for. Silas watched from the shade of the wraparound porch, leaning against a wooden pillar, grinning like a schoolboy. He found himself doing that a lot these days, just standing there, watching his wife exist, wearing an expression of pure, unadulterated contentment. The town's gossip had died down, mostly because Elara had silenced it in the most spectacular way possible. Lydia Sterling had stopped coming around for charity visits about a month ago. The last time Lydia had visited, she had made a snide comment about Elara's weight. In response, Elara hadn't cried. Instead, she had saddled Silas's biggest, wildest stallion while 5 months pregnant, and challenged the town's best riders to a race to the creek and back. The town had watched in shocked silence as Elara left every competitor in the dust, handling the massive beast with a grace that made her look like she was born in the saddle. Lydia hadn't returned since. Some women, Silas thought as he watched the sun catch the gold in Elara's hair, were just born to be queens, and Elara was undeniably the queen of this territory. She had flourished in ways he hadn't even dared to hope for. True to his word, Silas had taught her. She had learned to read in 3 months, devouring the library books at night by the fire. She was already keeping the ranch ledgers better than he ever had, finding discrepancies the bank had missed and saving them a small fortune. She could birth a calf, break a horse, and balance the accounts, all before supper. But more than any of that, she was happy. Silas could see it in ways she moved, the way she laughed with the hands, and the way she rested her hand on her enormous belly, talking to their unborn child about the ranch like she was introducing an heir to their kingdom. "What are you smiling about over there, old man?" Elara called out from yard, catching him staring. Silas chuckled, pushing off the pillar and walking down the steps into the dirt. "Just thinking about how smart I am," he called back. Elara laughed, a rich, deep sound that rolled across the ranch like music. She wiped the dust from her forehead, her eyes sparkling. Don't you mean how lucky you are? Silas shook his head. He walked right up to her, surrounded by the swirling dust of the cattle and the empire they were building together. He had to crane his neck to look up at her. He would always have to look up at her, and he had never been more grateful for anything in his life. Not lucky, he said loud enough for Roberts and the other hands to hear. Smart. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, resting it on the curve of her stomach where their child kicked against his palm. I was smart enough to know that the biggest thing I would ever see wasn't this ranch, Silas said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. It wasn't a fortune, and it wasn't that emerald ring. He squeezed her hand. It was you, Elara. It was your strength, your courage, your refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are. Elara's eyes filled with sudden tears, but her smile remained bright and fierce. She looked down at this man who had given her the world, and then at the land she now commanded. The biggest I will ever see, she whispered, echoing the words he had said to her on that terrifying wedding night. But they both knew she wasn't talking about the ring anymore. She was talking about the love they had built, the future they were creating, and the undeniable truth that she was exactly enough. Silas pulled her down for a kiss right there in the ranch yard with all the hands watching. And nobody laughed, nobody whispered. They just smiled and tipped their hats going back to work. Because everyone on the Thorne Ranch knew the truth now. Sometimes the biggest blessings come in the strongest packages. And Elara Thorne was the biggest blessing Wyoming had ever seen. Wow, what a journey for Elara and Silas. From a terrifying wedding night to becoming the power couple of the frontier. It just goes to show that true strength isn't about fitting in, it's about standing out. If this story touched your heart, please do me a solid favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories. It helps us grow the channel and bring more of these hidden gems of the Old West to life for you. And hey, if you loved this one, make sure to check out our channel playlist on the screen right now for more tales of romance, danger, and redemption on the frontier. I have a question for you guys before you go. Have you ever had a trait or a flaw that you were insecure about, only to find out later it was actually your greatest strength? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you so much for watching, folks. Take care of yourselves, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story.